Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We apologize for being just a minute or two late. We were working out some technical issues here, so thank you so much for being patient. We are very excited that you're here today. Ed Kless will be presenting Healing Leadership for us, and we are pleased to present this webinar as a benefit of AFWA membership. So thank you so much. And we just have a few housekeeping items before we begin. This program does qualify for one CPE unit based on 50 minutes of instruction and with questions and answers to follow. And to qualify for this CPE, you must be on the webinar for the entire time, and you must participate in all 3 polling questions. CPE certificates and evaluations and the slide deck will be sent within 1 week following the presentation. And we've got a lot of material covered today. So if you have any questions, please, you can write them in the Q&A, and we'll try to take some time throughout the webinar, and our instructor will be able to answer them either during the polling break or at the end. So we do encourage you to participate with any questions that you might have. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our instructor, Ed Kless from Sage Accountant Solutions. Ed is our Senior Director of Partner Development and Strategy for Sage, and he's also the host of Sage Advice Podcast. So Ed joined Sage in July of 2003 and is currently the Senior Director of Department of Partner Development and Strategy, and he develops and delivers curriculum for Sage business partners on the art and practice of small business and consulting, including the Sage Consulting Academy, business strategy, and customer experience workshops. So Ed, we really want to thank you so much for doing this webinar for us, and we're very pleased that you're here to help our members. So at this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Ed. So without further ado, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Cindy. My honor and pleasure to be with you guys today. Really appreciated it. And when I get adjusting to this, the post-COVID place where we are, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is how when I usually do this presentation in a big room, I have blaring song that is the intro, and it is the disturbed version of Simon and Garfunkel's classic, The Sound of Silence. If you haven't heard this version, strongly recommend it. And even if you love that version of the song, you will not most likely like anything else by Disturbed unless you're really into heavy metal. But they do a great job with this song, The Sound of Silence. And of course, one of the great lyrics that Paul Simon shared with us in that song going back to 1968, I believe, is people talking without speaking and people hearing without listening. And I really think that just about summarizes a lot of the things that we're seeing and hearing in the media and elsewhere. And one of the other insights that that song shares with me, they talk about the people bowed and prayed to the neon god they made. And the neon god, if you haven't made the poetic interpretation of it, is television, right? The people bowed and prayed to the neon god they made. And I think of all of the things that we've seen and witnessed on television these really past few months, especially even the last week or so, and how people have become to worship their side, right? Worship their side, whether it's CNN or Fox or whatever, but they go and pray to the neon god. Not everyone, clearly, but I think a lot of people do. And it's interesting. The introduction for today's class is that this is taken from a book by the same name, Healing Leadership, by my mentor, a guy by the name of Howard Hansen. Howard was the vice president of human resources with what was Great Plains Software. It was since sold to Microsoft in, I think, in the year 2000 or so. But Howard had a really interesting position in that he helped grow the company from 30 people when he first got there to over 1,000 people, or I think close to 3,000 people when it was finally sold to Microsoft, and was dramatically impactful in that, and then has had just tremendous amount of experience. And he and his partner, Steve Geske, who is unfortunately now deceased, wrote this great book that I've been a great advocate of, Healing Leadership. And it's a double entendre. It's a double entendre. The first meaning is that leadership as a concept in business today is broken, and it needs to be healed. The very notion of leadership in most businesses, I think, really has some significant challenges that it faces. The second thing is that the second entendre, the second meaning is that if done well, however, leadership itself in small businesses or in businesses can actually heal people of the wounds that they have sustained over time, and not just the wounds that they faced in business, but the wounds in their lives. And I think we have a very unique opportunity in business today to be the place where a lot of the healing around society can begin to take place. I don't mean this in the wrong way, but in a lot of cases, our institutions that we see today, government, even our religious institutions, churches, not-for-profit organizations as well, and even large businesses, or I shouldn't say large businesses, I should say mature businesses that are no longer entrepreneurial, have a tendency to want to just preserve the status quo. That's their mission. I mean, think about it. What a lot of these institutions want to do is preserve the status quo. It's only in entrepreneurial organizations, and they can be large, but they tend to be smaller, where the mission is to disturb the status quo, to change things, to make things better. And I think that what this means is that these are the institutions, these small businesses, these entrepreneurial organizations can be the place where leadership can be healing because of this, because of their nature is to, in fact, disturb the status quo. All right, though, that's the kind of the setup. Let's talk a little bit about some of the material that I want to share with you. The first is to share this, one of my favorite all-time quotes, and that is from this gentleman named Edwin Friedman. Now, Edwin wrote a book that is really a precursor to Howard and Steve's book called A Failure of Nerve: Leadership in the Age of the Quick Fix. And this book came out in 1983 or 84. Edwin Friedman unfortunately passed away before it was official. So it's gone through a couple of iterations with his intellectual heirs trying to work out the kinks, because it was an unfinished work at the time. But this quote is right in the introduction, and it is directly from Friedman. And he says, "The colossal misunderstanding of our time, the assumption that insight will work with people who are unmotivated to change." First of all, I love the word colossal here, right? Which is why I put it in red. The colossal misunderstanding of our time is the assumption that insight will work with people who are unmotivated to change. And we see examples of this all over the place. In fact, Friedman in the book, in A Failure of Nerve, points this out, that this is a universal concept, that it certainly is something that happens inside families, right? If you have a teenager, or even sometimes a young child, if you just think, if I can just give them that golden nugget, that insight, they'll go, "Oh, right, Dad, got it now. Sure. No, yep, makes perfect sense." And as those of you who have had children know, it doesn't work like that, right? There's no piece of logic. There's no fact that you can often share with somebody who doesn't want to change that will make them go, "Oh, I got it. Yep, now I'm with you now." So it's a misunderstanding. Again, if they don't want to change, if somebody is motivated to change, then yes, those facts can. But if people are entrenched, if people are entrenched in their position and don't want to see the possibility of it being something different from how it is right now, then there's nothing you could do. No fact, nothing you can drop on them in Facebook that's going to make them change their mind. And this, of course, is not just in your family, but is probably happened in the workplace. It happens in religious institutions, as I said. It certainly happens in international relations, to take this up to really an absurd scale. But if you remember back in one of the Second Gulf War, there was this whole thing about us sending the inspectors in to Iraq to look for weapons of mass destruction, which, you know, depending upon your view, either did or did not exist. But there was a very significant fact on before Saddam Hussein, which is unless you let the UN inspectors in, you're going to be invaded. But Saddam Hussein was not motivated to change, right? There was no piece of information that we could give him that would make him change his mind. So this is a very universal quote, and I think it's challenging for us because we want this to be true. We want it to be true that we can just give people the facts and they'll come around and see it our way. And I think a lot of leadership, leadership education, the way it's structured today, is unfortunately looking at those things. It's looking for those hints, those tricks that we can do. And of course, it's not couched like this. But anyway, we'll get there. So this is the opening quote I wanted to share with you on this. I want to talk a little bit about this next, and that is signs of organizational gridlock. Now, just let me be clear in here. Every organization has one or more of these, every single one. It's not possible to have an organization where this kind of thing doesn't exist. But I just want to put this list up here and give you some sense for it. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm not going to read them all to you. You can take a look at this. But I want to just you to look at the list and see, okay, yeah, this one does or does not apply within my organization. And just with you, a couple of these that jump out at me whenever I look at this list. And whenever I do this presentation, I pick the different ones each time, really depending upon what's happened to me in the last couple of weeks at my job, right? And that is this notion of let's take resistance and sabotage as one. Right, so resistance and sabotage. Now, more interesting things about this is there is a difference between resistance and sabotage. Resistance is usually individuals, right? There are individual people who are resistant to ideas, resistant to change, resistant to moving on. Sabotage is when the group of those resistance people get together and start to do it as a group, right? And actively sabotage what it is that's trying to take place. And I will say this, and this is where we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the different types of leadership modes, that a leader who's doing things well should expect resistance and sabotage. We should expect it. In fact, we should look for it as a sign that we're doing something right, that we are having a significant change or looking to have a significant change take place in our organization. If you don't have resistance and sabotage, you're probably doing something wrong. It just means that people are just giving you a lot of placation and not really getting involved in the change, because this stuff is hard, right? The other one that I see is this unending treadmill of trying harder. I'm reminded whenever I talk about this one of the book Animal Farm. And if you remember that book from high school or college, or if you haven't read it, I'll give you the short of the long of it. The unbeknownst to the rest of the animals on the farm, the pigs are running the joint and have this never-ending demand for more and more production. Well, because after all, they are pigs, right? So they want more and more production. And Boxer, who's the horse, has this line that he says, I don't know, 3 or 4 times in the book, whenever the increased production request or demand, I should say, comes down, he says, I shall try harder. I shall try harder. And I don't want to give away the end, but Boxer doesn't quite make it to the end of the book. He breaks down and, ends up getting sent, unfortunately, to the glue factory, even though the rest of the animals are told that he's going out to pasture and stud and all this stuff. But, in his dying breath, of course, it's a tale against socialism. And he's going to be able to live out his life and his dreams, and is really, even in his death, is helping the community by being turned into glue. So we see these different things, these signs of this organizational gridlock. And what I think that we tend to do is we try to react specifically to them as an individual versus look at them more systemically. And I think this is one of the great lessons that Howard and really Edwin Friedman has shared with me, is this notion that we can't necessarily just look at the individual things that are happening, these different diagnoses, these different symptoms that I was looking for, and say, let's treat those individual symptoms. We have to look at the disease itself more holistically. And what this has come down is that we see these real true I'll call them traditional leadership models, and they fall in and out of favor over time. Probably the one that when I first started working in the 80s that was far more prevalent was this notion of power, right? Influencing others to do what is believed that should be done. So there's this real influence, and there was in a way it was the person with a very charismatic. So it was not always coercion, but it was still this notion of, okay, we have this fantastic leader, this person, and everybody adapts to this person's way. Probably the best person, Steve Jobs would be an example of this. I mean, successful in the sense that Apple under his tutelage, at least the second time, did tremendously well, and probably one of the most innovative companies in the history of the world. But his leadership style wasn't exactly one that we go, okay, let's make sure that we model more of that, right? So what this power, and then there was this replacement sort of came in the 90s and 2000s. The servant leader, the leader that takes the responsibility. We often looked at this person as a good thing, right? That they came in at the white knight. They would come in and save the people, and fix things. The problem is that both of these models work on fixing the anxiety of the individual situation, as described in the previous slide, all of those different situations, but ultimately end up failing and don't really get to the root of the problem. And here's why. Let's go through this. I'm sorry. Before we jump in, let's do the first poll question, Cindy, if you would, right? So let's just talk about that. I could share that first poll question out there. I'm not sure. Okay, good. I'm gonna see that as well. All right. So I want to know, to what level do you agree with the following statement, that you have had experiences with toxic leadership has done damage with people? Just want to kind of get a feel for this inside this group and see. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the real notion of how we can perhaps begin to think about correcting some of this stuff.
Ed, there was also a question in the chat about when you had those that list up there. What does adapting towards the least mature mean?
Sure. Great. Yeah, that's good. I'll address that question, and Cindy, you can close the poll whenever you're ready. Are you going to show the answers just so that I can see them as well? Do you
yes.
normally do that? Okay, just
yes.
like percentage. Okay, so wow. Okay. All right, so 95% have actually seen where toxic leadership has done some damage. Okay, yeah, I'm there with you. Okay, okay. So let me address that question, and thanks for bringing that up. So adapting toward the least mature. It's really, think about it like in terms of fractions. Remember, in order there was least common denominator. We hear that term. We have to find out what the least common denominator is, and in order for us to move forward and be successful. And what a system tends to do, it adapts to the least mature in the system. A great example of this would be expense reports. Expense reports are an example of a system that has evolved to take into account the least mature. There's a guy by the name of Ricardo Semler, and his company is called Semco. They're based out of Brazil. He's written a book called Maverick, and one of the things that Semco does, its organizations, is everyone who comes to work for Semco, regardless of position, is given, I believe it's an American Express card, but let's just call it an expense card, a credit card for business expenses. And they're told the following: if you need something to do your job better, put it on this card. We don't audit it, we just pay it. We trust you that you can make a decision that says, okay, I need something to do my job better, whether that's you need to buy a new computer, whether that's you need to take a class, whether that's you need to, whatever it is that think you need to do in order to get your job better, put it on this card and we just pay it. That's an extraordinarily mature system. And if you think what's happened with expense systems, what they've done is they've evolved to, in cases, to weed out the least mature, which would be the person who's trying to commit fraud. Now, what Semler says when asked about this, he said, well, is it possible that people are going to cheat? Is it possible that people are going to buy stuff that they don't really need? He says, well, yeah, it's possible. He says, but what does it do from the standpoint of instilling trust in them? He said most people in his organization are customer facing, and they can honestly cause sometimes millions of dollars of damage to a customer relationship situation by saying something inappropriate or doing something that's inappropriate. That if they buy a new computer, compared to that, like it's, $1 million in damage. He goes, and if I don't trust them, we shouldn't hire them. Now, I will say that the process of getting a job at Semco is extraordinarily challenging, right? There's lots and rounds of interviews. You're going to talk to lots of people in your potential organization. They're going to make sure that if they hire you, that you're the right fit. And of course, there's an extraordinary amount of incentive to make sure that that's happened when you have a policy such as, well, we're just going to give you an expense card and you just pay it. We just pay it, right? So, so that's the notion of adapting to the least mature. Thanks for that question. I hope that made sense. Now, what I wanted to talk about next is the anxiety, and this is beyond business here. I've got a 24-hour cycle here to show you this. But one of the great things that Howard and Steve do, or have shared with us, is this notion of breaking down anxiety into two subcomponents. The first one that you see represented in green is what they call chronic anxiety. Now, chronic anxiety is the anxiety that you and I have with us all of the time, even when we sleep, because it sometimes invades our dreams, right? And so we always carry this chronic anxiety with us, this level of chronic anxiety with us as people. Now, it does change, right? I'm just showing you one day. It does change. We'll talk a little bit more about this in just a little bit. But that's the chronic anxiety. And then the second type of anxiety that Howard and Steve talk about is the episodic anxiety. And this is, or sometimes I'll say transactional, but they use the word episodic to describe it. So these are the episodes that happen throughout the day. And what you might see here on this is, okay, so 10 o'clock is the time when I'm trying to get the kids out to camp in the summer. Well, if they went to camp do that anymore. But we actually are opening up a little bit. My son does have baseball practice, so there was some of that a little bit earlier today, making sure that he was out and I was back in time to do the webcast. So there's anxiety that happens, and maybe, you know, the one at 4 o'clock is that meeting with your boss or a customer situation. And then, you know, this ebbs and flows, and as you can see, it kind of goes up and down throughout the day and might differ based on the days. Now, there's a certain point for all of us where we reach a threshold over which, if our anxiety level gets, we begin to break down. We begin to lose our ability to think creatively, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. But psychologists might call this emotional hijacking, where all of a sudden we now are just feeding emotions in our response and not really actively thinking about the situation at hand, and we're just kind of get stuck, and it takes us a while to get past that. And you see, once we get over that threshold, you know, that's the thing that kicks in. That's when we really feel this tremendous sense of anxiety. Before that, it's just been in the background. And this level is perhaps different for all of us, but we do have that threshold. Well, what most of the leadership tools that are out there are all about addressing this different kinds of episodic anxiety. So what would you do to make sure that when you are getting your son out to baseball practice, that, you know, that things are in place? Maybe you can set the equipment out the night before so that it's ready to go, because you know that he's always going to be, if it doesn't do that, he's always going to be stumbling for it and trying to find his, you know, cleats, right? So you make sure that stuff is available. So a lot of the stuff is targeted at these specific episodes at an organization different, like these crucial conversations, for example, might be a great example of this. So crucial conversations, when we're going to have that crucial conversation, how can we prepare ourselves for it? The trouble is that when this happens, this next thing happens, I want to show you this. When a person's level of chronic anxiety is significantly higher than someone else's, so and we overlay that same day's worth of episodic anxiety, you can see that what happens is that the person who's in this condition lives most of their life at this extraordinarily high level of anxiety and is in this constant state of emotional hijacking, and is unclear in their thinking, has perhaps an inability to problem solve. And one of the reasons for this is that anxiety and creativity are always inversely proportional to each other. So let me say that again. Anxiety and creativity are always inversely proportional to each other. The more anxious you are, the less creative you can be. And we can't turn on creativity. It's near impossible to turn creativity on. In fact, saying, I need to be creative now, actually increases your anxiety, right? So we're like, I gotta do this. I gotta be creative. I gotta come up with a creative solution now, and I gotta do it now. So if you buy, and that's true, and I think we can see that in our lives, what we need to do is, rather than try to turn on creativity, we must actually decrease our level of anxiety. And yes, there are certain things that we can do to decrease the level of anxiety from an episodic standpoint, but the real underlying problem is the chronic anxiety that people carry around with them. And very little leadership material is directed at dealing with that chronic level of anxiety. And I have definitely been thinking about this in terms of what we're seeing happening in Minneapolis and other places. is that, yeah, this transactional anxiety, this episodic anxiety clearly hits when something happens. But it's the chronic anxiety that's been carried around for an awful long time that is really the huge challenge. And everybody wants to talk about and deal with the episodic stuff, but it's really the underlying chronic anxiety that we need to address and deal with societally as well as in our individual lives. I think that part of the extreme that we're seeing, and this is not anything away from the horrible situation that happened in Minneapolis, that collectively our chronic level of anxiety has been raised to higher than it was due to what was happening with COVID-19. So if you want to say it was transactional or episodic level on top of episodic anxiety, yes. But you see what happens when we have that, when people are in this state of heightened chronic anxiety, the threshold is much easier to cross. And I think we need to begin to take that kind of thinking into account. So let me just pause there and see if there are any questions. I'm not seeing any questions in the panel, but that might just be the way things are set up, Cindy. So I don't, if there's any further questions, I'd like to address them at this point.
No, there aren't any in the Q&A.
Okay. I'm going to ask, because this is one of the things about delivering this session, especially without not seeing anyone's face, that makes it difficult, challenging, is that I know that some of this material makes people uncomfortable, and I just want to say straight out that if I've made you really uncomfortable about this, I don't apologize for it, but I do suggest that perhaps it's not worth the CPE credits to continue. I don't know if that's probably heresy, but I know, take care of yourself first. Take care of yourself first, and if this has been challenging for you, make sure you do that. Okay. The next topic that I want to introduce to you is something that I find equally fascinating, and this is this notion of emotional triangles. And the first thing before I describe them is let me just say this. Don't think that you're going to avoid this, right? You can't avoid emotional triangles. They are always around. We are part of them. It's parcel of being a human being is to be involved in these things because we have relationships with others and with things. So there's no way for you to eliminate this from your life. What I'd like to share with you is that recognition of when you are in an emotional triangle is probably really helpful. So that's what I would strongly encourage you to do, is try to be more aware of them. Now, that said, I've been studying this topic for the better part of about 15, maybe 20 years with Howard and Steve as they evolved their thinking on this. And I still struggle with this. I still find that I only recognize myself in a triangle situation about 3 times in 10, which, I'm a baseball guy. So it's that, I'm a 300 hitter. That's pretty good. So, Hall of Fame career. So the notion of giving yourself a little forgiveness in just not recognizing all of these situations when you're in them. But so let's talk about this. So there's A, B, and C, and that's the points on the triangle. And A, B, and C can be 3 different people, right? So A can be person A, person B, and then person C, and they can be in this triangle. But sometimes the A and B are things, or one of them is a thing. So, for example, if you've seen any situations where you have a spouse Or let's talk about a parent that might have a codependency on, say, alcohol or something like that. Alcohol is the B, and the child would be the C, right? So there's person A, who's the person. B is the alcohol, and then C is the person who is trying to deal with the relationship of person A with alcohol, right? So we have that's what's known as the inside position, the main position, the inside, the A and the B. And there's a level of anxiety between those two people or things that is constantly in play, right? And it's a push-pull kind of thing. It's constantly either increasing, decreasing. It's always in a state of flux. But then there's the person who's in the outside position. And let's take this as an example. All right, so I'm going to use a personal example. My son, who is going into 9th grade, is doing a history of art class over the summer remotely. And which is great. I think that's fantastic. He's not able to go outside as much and play with his friends. So knocking out a credit course before he even gets into high school is fantastic. He unfortunately started the class 3 or 4 days later than was anticipated. So he's had to try to play catch up in all of this. And my background is I'm a project manager, right? And for software implementations, and like I had this real thing going where, buddy, you need to catch up. We need to catch up. All right. So A and B in this particular case is me, I'm A, and my son is B, right? And I've got this level of anxiety with him about the situation of him caught up for this art class. My wife is person C, and what her role is, or unfortunately, what a lot of people think that C's role is to try to mediate between A and B, right? Because I'm telling my son, hey, you got to get caught up. He's like, Dad, back off. I got this. I want to play Fortnite with my friends for a couple of hours every day. This is the way it's going to be. And I'm like, but you're still fine. And my wife, to her credit, did not enmesh herself in this and become the fixer between me and my son. She did not. She maintained this outside position on the triangle. The conflict. In other words, she let us have our conflict. And she did not take a side. She didn't, what she did was she observed it and was present for some of these conversations, and allowed herself to be the non-anxious person in this outside position, not backing either one of us. And as a result, over this past weekend, last week was the week 1 of the class, over this past week, my son and I have been able to work this through our own, and we have now a plan in place, and I can say that my relationship with him is now stronger because of this. But if my wife had come in and fixed it, that would not have been helpful. That would not have been helpful for the relationship. And I think, unfortunately, what happens far too often in business especially is the person who's in this C role, the leadership role, goes in and fixes it, makes the fixing happen, or tries to, and in some cases fails miserably, and now A and B still don't like each other, and they both hate C. And then in other cases, C, quote, fixes the problem, but the A and B problem still exists. It was just because C came in and oftentimes via dictate said, this is how things are going to be, that it never really resolved itself. So we get in these positions of these outside, we want to maintain our outside position on this. And what I'm going to do this, and we'll talk about this next, is this notion of not being a non-anxious present leader, a non-anxious but present leader. All right, so I hope I've set that up. This is probably the most confusing piece of my presentation. So I want to be, if you've got questions on this, it would be a good time to ask them. And it's also time for the second question too. So we could jump into that, that would be great. So to what level do you agree with the following statement? Understanding emotional triangles will make a difference in how I now work with others. Of course, I'm presupposing that I did a good job explaining it, which might not be the case. So let's just hope that I did. All right, while we're waiting for that question. Oh, and Cindy, were there any questions that were typed in before I move on?
No, we're good.
Okay. Okay. And we've got about 18 or so minutes left. I do want to make sure that I'll try to have about 5 left over for any additional questions that you might have. So if you've got a question, if you've written it down, now might be the time to kind of type it in. So when we get to that point toward the end, be able to address those things. All right, so let's see what we got. Great. Okay. Good. I did at least a decent job with everybody at least agreeing somewhat. So thank you. I'm glad that was able to communicate that effectively to you. All right. So this next thing kind of combines some of the things that we've talked about together. And so let's talk about these different 4 modes of being for a leader. I've already talked a little bit about the anxious versus non-anxious. And I think we understand this notion of anxiety, right? So I think we can understand what somebody who is non-anxious is. But then the y-axis on this 2x2 is absence versus presence. But absence doesn't necessarily mean physical absence or physical presence for that matter. And this was even drawn home to all in the last 3 months or so. We still can practice present leadership by not going to an office. As a side note, those of you who might be familiar with the term ROWE, results only work environment, which is if you haven't delved into that topic, strongly recommend that you think about looking at that. But Jody Thompson, who is the author of the book Why Work Sucks and How to Fix It, has this great line about this. She says, "Work is a thing you do, not a place you go." And she said this like 15 years ago, and I think that has really come home to us. But it's directly related to this. We can still practice present leadership even though we aren't in physical proximity of people. And people can also be absent leaders even if they're in the office every day. And by that, I just mean that they take a step back and are often ignoring, not ignorant, but ignoring of what's going on. So this is the 4 types. And I think let's talk about the absent leaders first. We have the defector. This is a person who has a tremendous amount of anxiety and brings this anxiety, and when they are actually, but through their absence causes anxiety. Right, so through their lack of being present for people causes anxiety. Oftentimes, this kind of leader is one who just maybe swoops in at the end, gives criticism, and then leaves. So that would be a defector. We have the hermit leader who's non-anxious, but they're absent, very aloof would be another way to describe this. They just do not have any presence with their people. They're just just let things go. They're not worried about it, but there's no engagement. There's no presence for them. Probably the one that I see most often is, and I talked about this earlier, this savior or white knight leader who is in a way an anxious presence. Right? They're present, definitely present. They're with you, but they, in some cases, amp up the level of anxiety. A way to think about this is like a step-up transformer in electromagnetics. This idea that a person by their presence increases the anxiety of people. And then we have this true leader, which is the person who is what I call the non-anxious presence. Now, I want to just be clear about something. I did mention this earlier, but there's no sweet spot in this 2x2. the true leader, the non-anxious presence, has an awful lot to contend with, because if they're doing their leading well, there will be resistance and sabotage, because there are people who prefer the anxiety situation to happen. There are people who cause anxiety to happen, wanting to keep the leader distracted by what's going on, and hence cause resistance and potentially sabotage, where people are getting together to do that. So there's the notion of this leadership, and where do you need to be on this. I want to give you a quick example of this idea of a non-anxious present leader. And I alluded to this earlier in this story, but my favorite example is Chesley Sullenberger. I'm sorry, Captain Chesley Sullenberger, Sully, the guy who landed the plane in the Hudson. And there's a fantastic interview that was done by Katie Couric, I believe, on 60 Minutes about a year or so after the incident. And at one point, she turns to ask Captain Sullenberger. She says, Captain Sullenberger, did you pray? And Sully, who as I said, is a non-anxious presence, said, no, ma'am. There were 150 people behind me taking care of that. My job was to successfully crash the aircraft. And I love that phrase, successfully crash. And that's exactly what he did. It was not a landing, he didn't call it a water landing. He said it was a successful crash. And I've often used that phrase in thinking about the things in business, probably something that's over you right now, that you probably should think about the best way to successfully crash it, instead of continuing to invest in it and trying to make it work. And I think that's one of the great distinguishing characteristics of the difference between the savior or white knight leader and the true leader. The person who recognizes, oh no, what I have to do here, I have to successfully crash this. That's what I need to do. So thanks on that. Okay. We got about 10 minutes left, and I said I would try to save 5 for questions. So I'm going to just go through a couple of wrap-up things to get the last question. And then I do see that there's been a couple of comments and questions in here as well. So I will make sure to get to them. But if you have any others, please feel free to type them in. So let's talk about this process and presence, right? Power lies in presence rather than method. It's just yes, it's physical presence, but it's also emotional presence, being fully present for someone, being fully engaged in the moment with them. That's really key. We mentioned leaders should try to avoid, try to instill insight into the unmotivated. If somebody is not motivated, if they don't think that there's a possibility, and I love, in fact, using that word possibility with people. Possible that you could be wrong about this. Is it possible? Not even probable, or is it possible? And see what they say. If they say, no, there's no possible way I could be wrong. Well, then don't fight them anymore. Don't try to prove that they're wrong, because they don't see that there's any possibility of them being wrong. So just move on. Self-definition is the ability to respond non-anxiously to these anxious situations, and also always be on the lookout for these triangles. They're all over the place. Some principles that I want to talk about non-anxious and present leadership is that what we want to do is have the capacity to separate ourselves from the emotional processes. And I want to emphasize, this is probably a very uncouth thing to say, very not popular, but not empathy. I think empathy is dangerous. And when I say empathy, I mean the empathy in the original sense of the word. Empathy is a new word. It came into our vocabulary about 1920, 1930 out of German psychology. And you want to think about Germany in the 20s or 30s, you can see where that got them. But this notion of empathy, and it means in suffering. The pathos means suffering. And the EM prefix means in. It means remember Bill Kless, I feel your pain, right? That I feel what you feel. I think that's actually a psychological disorder to feel someone else's pain, right? Well, it's not helpful if we have someone in pain or someone who's experiencing a high level of anxiety, and we empathize and become anxious with them, which is what empathy is. That, again, that's the original meaning. Now, I think the word that most people are searching for and is still better word is compassion. And there's the pathos again, right? There's this, and ka means with suffering. In other words, I am present with somebody in their anxiety. I'm with them. I am present for them. It's Captain Sullenberger. He did not let anxiety get the best of him. He had to figure out a way to successfully crash the aircraft. If he had felt empathy for the people behind him, they wouldn't have survived, right? So, but he was present in the moment. Okay. Self-regulation in the face of reactive sabotage. Again, you're going to see those things. And I think there's lots of great stuff here. We've talked, vulnerability has been written extensively about. Brene Brown has done some really great work there. Although I don't like her latest book. I like her earlier stuff better, but that's beside the point. And then lastly, before I get to these questions, I want to talk a little bit about what self-differentiated leaders do in times of crisis. And certainly, I think we were going through many crises at the same time. And humor, you can read through all of these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but humor is really key. The ability to not make light of the situation, but introduce humor into tense situations is extraordinarily powerful. It's not inappropriate humor. We have to be careful of, Michael Scott isms here, right? I'm not talking about that kind of stuff, but appropriate in the moment. So oftentimes self-deprecating humor can be extraordinarily helpful in times of great crisis. The third one's key here: making decisions when the same questions brings little information. I've seen an extraordinarily amount of leadership suffering around this notion of people inability to make a decision, this analysis paralysis kind of thing. And I think it's only become worse over time with the introduction of more and more data, which is probably strange coming from the guy who works for the Sage, the company that creates lots of the data in accounting. But I think we have to in a way get a little bit past this notion of having to have perfect data in order to make decisions. Conclusive data is only available about the past. If you're making a forward-thinking decision, there is no data about that. Right? There is no data about that. Conclusive data is only available about the past. And the last thing that I want to share here is about self-differentiated leadership is this notion of confronting people with their freedom. Confronting people with their freedom. To me, this is the best definition of leadership I've ever seen. This 5-sentence: great leaders confront people with their freedom. People are individuals. They have individual choices to make, and your role, or a great leader's role, is not to make it for them or to even push them one way or the other, but to say, no, you as an individual have a choice to make. I think it's really important to note that there's been great work done by a guy by the name of Peter Block and Peter Kostenbaum in their book, Freedom and Accountability at Work, in which they posit that freedom and accountability are the same thing. If I choose accountability, and accountability isn't imposed on me. And one thing that I hear a lot over and over again is we need to get these people to be accountable. We need to get them to be accountable. If you're hearing or saying get people to be accountable, you're wrong, because accountability is chosen. I choose accountability to my son, my children. I choose to be accountable. I choose that. That's my choice to do that. And the same thing is true inside an organization. We choose to be accountable for our own results. We choose that. Otherwise, it's imposed. Otherwise, it's the man pushing us down. So if we want freedom, if we want to really, truly be considered free, we also, because it's the same thing, need accountability. We need to say we are accountable for our decisions. And I think that that's some of the dangerous things that we're seeing in the leadership conversation that's out there today. These 5-point plans that are going to be imposed by politicians. See, here, this is a very unfortunate reality. We would never vote for somebody, never, I don't think that there would be a huge flux to the polls to vote for someone who says, my role here is to be a non-anxious presence. We refuse to allow politicians to take that position on something when that's the very thing that we need, which is why I discount a lot of things from a political standpoint. What we need to do is bring this into our organizations, into our companies, because it's in entrepreneurial organizations where leadership can be truly healing. All right, let's get that last poll question up there, and it's about me specifically. If you are interested in getting a newsletter that I do a radio show with a guy by the name of Ron Baker. You might have heard of him on a weekly basis, called The Soul of Enterprise. And if you want to be added to that list so you can see what our upcoming shows. In fact, we do have Howard Hansen, who's the author of this book, coming up on a future episode, probably in late July. So if that's something that you're interested in. And while we're getting that last poll, and you don't need to put the results of this one, Cindy, up on the board, that's okay. Just want to leave this with you, this great quote from Michel de Montaigne, my favorite French philosopher, who it wasn't quite his dying declaration, but he did say this, near the end of his life, after having studied philosophy and really being a meta philosopher, que sais-je, which means, well, what do I know? What do I know? All right, turning my attention here to the questions here. Catherine asked, does the tone of voice make a difference in the type of leader? Oh, absolutely. Tone of voice is part and parcel of presence. Certainly, a tone of voice is something that's critically important. And by the way, I have a minor in musical theater, so of course I'm going to say that I have a vested self-interest in making that happen. But yeah, I think tone of voice is important, and I think that people need to work better on it, because you can say things in different ways and come across as highly anxious or non-anxious, just in depending upon how you say it. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. The others are just comments, like going back to psych class or college, but coming from a business perspective. Thank you for that comment. I appreciate that. And then, thank you. I think your company is fortunate to have you. Well, I think so too. I think so too. All right. That's all I see, Cindy. Was there anything else that I was missing and that I'm not seeing?
No, I just want to thank you so much. What a great program. And it's just so insightful with everything that you shared with us. So just want to thank you so much for doing the program for us. We greatly appreciate it. And on behalf of AFWA, would like to thank you for doing the presentation. And so very much appreciate it. And hopefully we can have you back again.
Oh, would love to. My honor and pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. And we will send out the CP certificates and everything within a week. So thank you all so much for joining us today.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.